FanDuel is giving all new customers a shot at $250 in bonus bets. Join FanDuel today. You'll get started with $250 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. From three-pointers to steals to assists, FanDuel has so many ways to bet your favorite player props. Plus, after the game tips off, you can even combine live prop bets into a same-game parlay for a chance to win big. Just visit FanDuel.com/sportsfan to get in on all the NBA play-in tournament action. That's FanDuel.com/sportsfan for your shot at $250 in bonus bets.
Discover the life-changing benefits of Meow Greens for your cat. Ever see your cat slowing down or having health issues and wonder, what can I do to make them better? Well, my friend, add Meow Greens to your cat's food for 90 days, and I guarantee you'll see changes that will amaze you. Greetings, I'm naturopathic Dr. Dennis Black, inventor of Meow Greens, and I invite you to take the Meow Greens 90-day challenge. In the first 30 days, you'll see shinier coats and increased energy. By day 60, your cat will have a stronger immune system, less shedding, improved joint function, all due to the live nutrients that you've added to their diet. And at 90 days, they're going to have better digestion, reduced inflammation, improved heart health, and you may even have reduced their cancer risk. Fetch a free Jumpstart trial bag for your cat today. Go to trymeowgreens.com. Use promo code TRYMEOW. That's try MEOW. You discover the shipping. You don't have to change your cat's food to improve your cat's health. Just add a packet of Meow Greens.
Hi everyone, Patrick here, cutting in before this episode to introduce the guest that I have on this week. So I had a chance to sit down with Karin Wells to talk about her new book, a relatively new book at the time that I'm releasing it. It was released about a month ago. So the new book is called Women Who Woke Up the Law, Inside the Cases That Changed Women's Rights in Canada, which, if you've been following just any of what's happening in North America, politically speaking, and socially speaking, I think this is a very timely book and one that deserves quite a bit of attention, and I think this conversation really highlights that. So a little bit on Karin. She is someone who grew up in British Columbia and is best known as a CBC radio documentary maker and a 3-time recipient of the Canadian Association of Journalists Documentary Award. Her work has been heard on radio networks around the world and has even been recognized by the United Nations as being particularly important. So she's written on women's issues such as abortion, for example, quite extensively, right? And she kind of does this again with this new book, although taking a more historical scope. So without further ado, I'll leave you to listen to this interview. And as always, I linked to the book in the description if people are interested. All right, cheers.
Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation.
Okay, so I'm here today with Karin Wells to talk about her new book, Women Who Woke Up the Law. So I guess we'll start off with the broadest question, which is, can you explain to listeners who might not be aware of it or who are interested in the book what exactly this book does and what you're trying to accomplish with it?
Well, I'll give you the sort of formal answer to begin with. It traces a series of court cases that start in the 1870s, just after Canada became a country and therefore had the ability to form its own laws. And it moves right up to the present, and through each one, a different issue is highlighted again through those court cases. So talks about divorce, talks about abortion rights, talks about maternity benefits, and this is the thing that mattered most to me and the thing that I found the most engaging. This is the history of the women who were involved in these cases, the lawyers to some degree, but it's the women who ended up either going to court and saying, I'm mad as hell and I want something better in my life, I want to change, or were taken to court one woman who killed her husband. Ultimately, it was found to be manslaughter, not murder. And what and how all of this happened and what it resulted in for them. Because that's where the stories are. You don't get court cases without complainants and plaintiffs and people going forward.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's what the book's about.
Yeah.
Stories.
This is something that you alluded to in your answer, but that I wanted to emphasize as particularly notable and interesting about your book was just the breadth of it, talking, as you said, from the 1870s to some rather contemporary cases,
Yeah.
right? So it's a huge breadth of historical scope that you're taking and of different types of cases, and yet it all feels as one cohesive whole in a really interesting way. And it's not often that you get to see that in books. And I just thought that that was a particularly highlight worthy aspect of it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I'm curious, right? How did you see yourself engaging in a particular gap in feminist legal theory or history, I should say, right? Because
Yeah.
it is,
There was no conscious
yeah.
effort.
Okay,
I mean, I've read some feminist history.
sure.
This was more a question of wanting to do another book and of grumbling and mumbling around to my friends and saying, I don't know what. And a friend who was my editor when I worked at CBC Radio, she said, well, for God's sake, you went to law school. Why don't you write something about the law? And I thought, well, yeah, okay. And she also mentioned, you see, and this is where it starts, not with the legal issue, because my friend is not a lawyer, but she said, well, there's Eliza Campbell. And I kind of went, who?
Yeah.
And she said, well, Eliza Campbell turns out to be a young woman from Whitby, Ontario, which is just outside Toronto, and back then was a much more important town, forgive me, Whitby, than it is today. Today, it's a suburb of Toronto, part of Durham. And she had married a Scottish immigrant, a man of a very Protestant puritanical background, and he decided she was fooling around on him. And he went off on a buying trip to England. He ran a dry goods store and had her spied on. And when he came back, his spies, that included his brother, told him that a man had come round. Turned out not to be the case, but he sued him, the other man, for what was called criminal conversation, which means sleeping with another man's wife, and took her to court. The way the law worked, she had no opportunity to defend herself. And he won. So she was thus labeled an adulteress, which was about as bad as it could be in the 19th century. It was like being labeled a murderer almost. Would have had her cast out of her house. On it went. She turned around and, with the help of a male lawyer in Whitby who was very much on her side, sued the brother for perjury, and she won. And I mean, there's wonderful stuff in the Whitby Chronicle, the town newspaper, that the Whitby Town Library has digitized and kept. Three cheers to them. But it chronicles how the Whitby Town Band came out and played at her door when she won, and all of this. Now, the case went on up to the Supreme Court, not to the Supreme Court, to the Parliament, which was the only way you could get a divorce in Ontario at the time, which is bizarre. Anyway, this was the basic story. And my friend, who was not a lawyer, said, well, there's her famous gravestone. I said, what gravestone? She is buried in Mount Pleasant Cemetery, the biggest cemetery in Toronto. And it's a tiny little gravestone that sits in the ground. It's not one of these big fancy mausoleums. And on it says, Eliza Campbell, 1844 to 1910. And then beneath it is carved, I did not commit adultery. I mean, she's screaming it from the grave, and somehow from the grave, this innocuous woman that nobody's ever heard of manages to exude her personality. And my friend said, well, she's a good. I said, well, she didn't really change the law. She didn't. No, she didn't. Because Canada did not get a Divorce Act until 1968. And that was, I mean, that all has to do with political history.
That's right.
Because Sir John A. Macdonald, going right back, didn't want to excite, antagonize Quebec, which, with the strength of the Catholic Church, was vehemently anti-divorce, and thus jeopardized the Union of Canada. It's hugely political and historical. And, there in the middle of it is this woman, Eliza Campbell, who, I mean, she lost her kids. She won in Parliament, and her friends had her lawyer's speech printed in the Whitby Chronicle. I mean, so it's quite amazing. Anyway, it's a long answer. So, but yeah, there you are.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And it gets at the heart. This is a question I'd written for later, but it gets at the heart of one of the epigraphs that you have at the start of your book, right? Which is the Bertha Wilson quote of change in the law comes slowly and incrementally, right?
Yeah.
This kind of permeates throughout the text, this kind of tension between legal precedent and shifting societal values. You bring this up in the case of Eliza Campbell, but is there any other case that you feel really demonstrates this kind of tension? Yeah.
Big time. I'm from the West. I grew up in British Columbia. And there's a Western case, I mean, from Alberta. I think there's at least 3 cases in the book that come from Alberta, partly because, it only became a province at the beginning of the 20th century. And it was making it up as it went along, as it were. Fair game. Sometimes you end up with a more interesting and apt set of laws than you might if you're burdened with the law that was generated by things 100 years previous. Yeah. Anyway, so in the 1920s, a baby was born in the foothills of the Rockies. Her father was a ranger, looking out for fires, up in the Rockies. And she, it was written in her obituary, she as a child learned to rope, to wrestle steers, to ride, to shoot. She was an Alberta woman, no princess, right? This was a hard-working, calloused hand woman. She married at 17 a man named Alex Murdoch, and she brought 6 horses to the relationship. I think he brought 15. And on they went to work ranches. And when they worked together on a ranch, the pay was handed to him for both of them, not separately. It was the way stuff was. And they went on to purchase a ranch. Well, in 1968, he had been insisting that they move further out away. They were by then living in Turner Valley, which was an oil town. It was becoming an oil town. And he wanted to move out. And she said, no, I'm not going to. They had a 12-year-old son at the time. And she had not signed the legal documents that would permit him to sell the ranch. And she dug in her heels. And he did what happened far too frequently, put his in this instance, cattleman's arm around her jaw and broke it in 3 places. And she had a speech impediment that lasted for the rest of her life. That bit is often left out of the legal recounting of cases. She then dug in her heels and said, what I want is a piece of the ranch. Because I put sweat equity, which is what we'd call it today, into this ranch. But the lawyers she saw repeatedly advised her that what you can get because of the Divorce Act is a lump sum payment. And she said, no, I want, no, out of the corner of her mouth, because her jaw was wired shut for literally years. And she finally found a lawyer who would take her case and argue for what she wanted, which was a next to impossible legal argument because it had never been done before. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and nobody noticed. It was just another case, a difficult case that was almost doomed to failure. And indeed, it did fail. She lost at the Supreme Court. But by then, somehow, it had excited public interest. And and she lost because only his name was on the deed. It was ruled she had not put a monetary contribution to the ranch. And there was a strong dissent from Mr. Justice Borelaskin. And he said there's this thing called a constructive trust, i.e., that the name on the deed, in this case the husband, was holding this, he would interpret it as in trust in part for her. Now, this was too modern an argument at the time for the court. But it was the groundswell of public opinion from urbanite women. This was the time when the women's movement was really strengthening, and also from more conservative Alberta farm wives and not only farm wives, who may have disagreed with many aspects of feminism at the time, definitely did, but were really dedicated to the land. This was their story. They too had dehorned, vaccinated, herded cattle, mucked out stores. And as the court had said, and this is what made them mad, really angry, this is just the work of any ranch wife. Well, no, bloody hell. It's not just to be taken for granted. No. And it was this groundswell that came from the country at large that was ahead of the courts. And Murdoch lost. She got a lump. She did end up getting money from the divorce, but not what she wanted. And within 2 years, the legislatures across the country, every one of them, had changed matrimonial property law through legislation. And it now says that a married couple, important to note, splits assets acquired during the course of the marriage. So again, another long-winded answer, but there you have it.
No, it's fine. And be as long-winded as you want. This is your rodeo as far as I'm concerned.
Oh,
go
goody.
for it. But it also ties in with the other or one of the other epigrams that I highlighted, which is the quote from Taming of the Shrew, right? Your answer does relate to that in some way, in the sense that quote that you bring up from Petruchio really highlights how the law and societal norms for a long time treated women as property to do whatever, was to be done, right? In this case, beat your wife as you saw fit, right? And I think it's an interesting thing that you highlight in your book, which is this echoing of women resisting against this very notion of being property, which is not necessarily something that 21st century women are necessarily as emphasizing as much, right? Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, I mean, it is hard to believe in this day and age, but looking back, it makes sense. Women were the weaker vessel, right? And marriage back then, and we're talking 15th, 16th century and before, was an affiliation of property among those who owned property. So, families combined. The notion of marriage for love was somewhat foreign. Occasionally it happened, but that wasn't what it was about. Yeah. It was about bringing together different pieces of property, and the woman embodied that. The woman was the weaker vessel. And of course that evolved, and then we shifted by the time you get to 19th century, which is difficult. Everything was modernizing, but the notion of the role of women was not moving as quickly. Women were put on a pedestal, which often, which seemed grand and fine. But, when you're on the pedestal, your feet don't touch the ground and you can't do anything. And that was the tension. So, perhaps it was well intentioned. Often women were not put on the pedestal, they were beaten into the ground.
Yeah.
But, that's where it started. So the woman was the property. And what we also forget, and what continued, is that children were the property of the husband. So, I mean, we've gone through, in divorce cases, we've gone through different phases where children were the property of the husband. Then we moved to a phase where young children should be given over to the mother, custody to the mother, because it was considered better for the children. And now we're in a phase that says little kids need both parents, So, but yeah, so that's, of course, women were the property. They weren't the fierce warriors, except in their own heads or in their own cleverness.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a lot that I can like pick up here on your answer. It's really great. But what I want to highlight, even in the 19th century, when you were saying that women were, or it was starting to be put on a so-called pedestal, right? It's often through very patronizing
Yeah, yeah,
ways,
yeah.
right? That did it often infantilize women, right? To tie it into
Totally,
that
totally.
children notion that you brought up, right? Um, and it's something, right? To emphasize this to the listeners, this idea of women as some kind of property through marriage is something that, again, it wasn't that long ago, right? My own parents, when they got married, it kind of caused a stir in the family when my mom didn't say love, honor, and obey in her marriage vows, right? She didn't necessarily put the obey part, and this was in the 90s, right?
Right,
So
right.
it wouldn't have been that long ago that
No,
people would have had somewhat of a taken aback reaction to people not quite dealing with the expectations of implied property ownership,
yeah.
marriage. Um, but yeah, very, very good. Um, but the other thing that you brought up in your question is the notion of agency, right? How women actually can form their own acts or act according to their own will, despite these massive societal pressures to act according to certain standards, patriarchal standards. And I'm curious how you actually approached this in your writing or in your research or in the construction of your book, the idea of highlighting women's agency while still highlighting the major constraints that they were put under, legally or otherwise. If
Yeah,
it's
I
something that you did.
chose the individual stories, forgive me, without much regard to all that. And this goes back to what my editor and I would talk about frequently when I was producing radio documentaries for CBC,
Yeah.
and she was a very strong feminist, but pointed out that the stories you wanted to tell were not the stories of misery and abject oppression. It always came up, but the stories of achievement and triumph, even though it might be minor. Well, usually it wasn't so minor, but hard fought. Um, you know, tell the stories of people who achieved things. And so I think this is where I came from with all of this. Now, in terms of agency and whose right it is to tell the story, you move into another area that's difficult because there's two stories. I'm a white woman. I'm an
Mhm.
old white woman. I tell the story of Jeanette Corbière-Laval, who was a
Yeah.
First Nations woman, um, fought a really important legal battle. She grew up and became an adult in the late 60s, early 70s. Such a vital period, all that period of real social activism and of people behaving badly,
Yeah.
people really kicking back. And when women did it, women weren't supposed to behave badly. So they were often sort of swept into a corner and people really wanted to ignore them, and they were even embarrassed themselves sometimes. So she grew up in that period. She, as a First Nations woman, married a non-Indigenous man. And under the Indian Act at the time, that meant she lost her status. She would be cast off the Indian registry in Ottawa, which meant she had no place on her reserve. She couldn't participate in band politics. She couldn't share any wealth, etc. Now, she didn't think much about it at the time. She loved this guy and she got married. Then she got a letter in the mail, which took her ages to open. She was enjoying her life and busy. And it said she'd been cast aside and taken off the registry. And she thought she would, maybe she should talk to someone about this. There was a young lawyer who was sitting on the sidewalk giving advice to American draft dodgers in Yorkville in Toronto, which was not a glossy high-end place at the time. It was coffee houses and where draft dodgers hung out. And she said, well, let's go see Clay. His name was Clayton Ruby, who became a very well-respected, very active human rights lawyer. And he said, well, yeah, we can try this, because he was a lawyer who took on difficult cases and who the fight had to be waged for wrongs that needed to be righted. But he did say to her, Jeanette, we've only got till tomorrow. They've only given you till this date to launch an appeal. But off they went. They went to the Supreme Court. It was a huge case where there was division within the First Nations community, big time. And she lost as well. But the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was brought in by Pierre Trudeau slightly thereafter. And one of the provisions was, or what happened was, that the federal government had to go through all legislation and look for areas where there seemed to be a lack of equality between men and women. And this was the point, because when status men married white or non-Indigenous women, the non-Indigenous women gained status. So this was the disparity. And I think 3 years later, Jeanette Corbière-Laval and thousands of other First Nations women regained their status.
Yeah.
So, but was that my story to tell? Back to the agency question.
Yeah.
That's the difficult one. Jeanette Corbière-Laval is the only woman in the book who's actually, there's one other at the center of one of these cases who is still alive. And I spoke to her, and I spoke to her daughter, and they seem to have no objection to me telling this story. So I told her. Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. That you brought up a few times the idea that not all of these cases that you describe ended up in success, right? A lot of them,
hardly any did.
yeah, exactly, right? And I'm wondering, right, how you see these failures as still igniting some kind of broader movement. Is the very notion of trying what usually kicks off the movement towards actual tangible change, or is it something else that, or is it the failure itself? Like how does that work? Yeah.
And I've written a previous book called The Abortion Caravan, which is the story of a small group of West Coast women, again from that period of, disreputable activism, who traveled across the country in a very noisy fashion in a pickup truck, a Volkswagen bus, and a Lincoln convertible. And by the time they got to Ottawa, they were 500 strong. They were demanding change to the abortion law because so many women were dying from backstreet abortions. Abortions always existed, and the government did not deign to meet with them. So they snuck themselves into the galleries of the House of Commons, chained themselves to their seats in the manner of the suffragettes of the early 20th century. And they began a speech that rotated between them from different parts of the gallery. They were, the chains were cut, they were thrown out, and they were on the front page of every newspaper in the country the next day. They did not change a thing, as many of these women who embarked on court cases did not. But they put it on the table. Because I mean, one of them, she'd stayed with her aunt in Calgary, and she was a stroppy young woman, working class woman. All of these women were, most of them were. And her aunt had said, I had an abortion, I had two abortions, but we do not discuss this. And that was the problem. So they put it on the table for discussion, just as Irene Murdoch did on the question of matrimonial property rights.
Yeah.
And just as the case of Jane Hirschman, who killed her husband, her very abusive husband in Nova Scotia, put on the table the question of self-defense. Now, that was putting on the legal table the difficulty and the need to redefine self-defense. So that goes back to the stuff about the law changing incrementally and with the times, and it doesn't work if it moves ahead of society. One's got to push the other, and it kind of goes back and forth.
Absolutely. And another thing that is raised in your chapter on Jeanette Corbière-Lavelle is that even within feminist movements themselves, there was there was
there
often
was
pushback.
division.
Yeah,
Sure.
exactly. There was pushback to Indigenous women's legal rights or any other type of fight that was happening. And I'm curious, what your book or what you feel your book says about these kinds of divisions and how people either overcome them or choose to ignore them, and how that actually impacts the legal cases that you're discussing.
Well, it's much easier to write looking backwards when stuff has already been decided, It was, and I'm back to the abortion stuff, which wasn't, in the case of the caravan, was not a legal case. Um, and there was big division because it was not seemly for women to do what they did, but you had this aunt, a woman of a different generation, in Calgary saying to her niece, no, we don't talk about this. But um, you also had, they addressed a union meeting in Sudbury, which was a bold thing to do at the time. Women unions, particularly strong, miners' unions of that nature, were not particularly sympathetic or supportive of women's concerns, some more than others. And one, it's legendary. One stood up and said, I'm here talking for my friend Janice. She'd be here herself, but she's dead from an illegal abortion. Well, when you start talking that way, it hits home. So modification and moderation and coming together begins to happen.
Yeah.
And thus you end up with a groundswell, united we stand.
Yeah.
It's that stuff. So that's the stuff that pushes. And now I can't quite remember what your question was, but
No,
there we are.
you kind of answered it. It was about divisions within within women's.
Yeah. And of course divisions exist.
Yeah,
We're not we're not a monolith either in terms of gender, in terms of race, none of that.
exactly. Yeah, for sure. And one of the things that, just to kind of shift topics about the book, one of the things that I think is interesting about women's history, and especially the history that you recount in the book, is this division between public and private, or this interplay between public and private, right? So, for example, in the cases, I highlighted the cases of Stella Bliss or Chantal Daigle, right? How media coverage might influence the legal outcomes that you cover or that fought for. And I'm curious if you could speak a little bit to that, right? How this tension between public action or public and private or personal actions kind of comes into play in some of the cases that you come mention.
Well, I mean, most of these women did not want to become the poster girl, you know. That shifted. I mean, you've seen cases, I think, particularly in the US, where a case has been backed, and thus the woman who brought the case has been backed as the champion of the cause. And that puts that individual in a very difficult situation. I mean, it's inevitably going to happen some instances. I mean, Irene Murdoch, comes to mind. I mean, this case goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. You got to remember that the Supreme Court is a place of legal argument. You don't have witnesses, you don't have dramatic courtroom scenes. You have, a series of 9 judges sitting up high in black robes listening to argument. And it doesn't go on that long. They've seen all the arguments set out on paper beforehand. And the individuals involved in the case don't appear at the Supreme Court. So Irene Murdoch, this was just her life. She was sitting back home in Turner Valley in a motel room because her husband had changed the locks on the place. She was impoverished. She was in debt. She just wanted this all to be over with. And when it was over with and she lost, she didn't want to talk to the press. She gave one interview to the press and then said, no, bugger off, basically. Similarly, Chantal Digg, and this was an incredible case. It embodies a couple of the things you've raised. She was a waitress, working as a waitress in Montreal. And again, these women were waitress, flight attendant, nurse's aide, secretary, etc. And she met a guy, she lived with him for about 5 months. She became pregnant. It was the year after the Morgentaler decision, which decriminalized abortion. And she said, I do not want this relationship to continue. I do not want a child of this relationship. I am going to have an abortion. And she told him, she didn't just sneak off and do it. She told him, she faced him and made the appointment. Well, through a curious set of circumstances, a similar case had come up in Ontario, and the father of the child, the purported father of the child, turned out that was a questionable thing as well, had sought an injunction preventing the woman having the abortion.
Yeah.
And Tremblay had heard of this. He then brings an action for an injunction and wins. So if she had gone ahead and had the abortion, she would have been in contempt of court and subject to $50,000 fine, something like that. So she held off. It went to the Quebec Court of Appeal, and was decided very quickly. And this all happened, everything from start to finish, within 2 weeks, because it was 20 weeks was the limit for legal abortion within Quebec at the time. Right. And off it went then up to the Supreme Court. Tremblay was winning. This was the battle between the Right to Life group and the pro-choice group, in essence. Plus, it was a constitutional battle between Quebec and the federal government in terms of human rights. What are the rights of the father? What are the rights of the fetus? And I mean, what drama at the Supreme Court, because they presented the original arguments, the first round of arguments. Mm-hmm. And at lunchtime, after lunch, the lawyer, who was, again, a legal aid lawyer, mm-hmm. He was barely out of law school, stood up.
A baby lawyer.
Had to say to the Supreme Court, I've just been informed that my client has had an abortion in Boston. And was she therefore in contempt of court, although she'd had the abortion out of the jurisdiction? Should they continue with the argument, even though action had forestalled it? I mean, the drama and the phone calls that went back to political masters, etc. the court decided that they should decide the case on the principle, and they decided that no one had the right to veto an abortion. The woman had to determine whether she would continue the pregnancy or not. And this was the woman's right under the Charter of Rights and Freedom to her autonomy.
Yeah.
So that's what that one was about, and that was vitally important.
Yeah, absolutely. And just continuing on this, your answer brings together a lot of the components that we've been talking about so far, right? Just through the vehicle of private-public, right? A woman's individual
and
choice.
well, and what she did,
Yeah.
Chantal Digg, it was a hugely public battle. I mean, women in Montreal took to the streets. 10,000 women marched before it went to the Supreme Court. That's amazing. But Chantal Digg, when the decision came down, basically said, thank you very much. And she returned to Chibougamau, population then 8,000, changed her name, married, and continued with her life,
Yeah.
as far as we know. I
In
mean,
the context, right?
managed to go private.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And you mentioned the Morgenthau case, which was a highly public case, right? And something that
Sure.
was very much covered at the time. Like it was just, as you said, just after that. So these dynamics permeate across that individual case, but also women's history. Just to pick off of an example of literary history, which I'm particularly interested in, right? The novel. The novel started off as a genre, right, based off of women's private letters. That's what evolved into the very public form of the novel, right? So this dynamic plays out throughout history, and I think it's really
Yeah.
fascinating to think about. Yeah.
Yeah, when we choose to make our lives public, and I mean, sometimes it feels like just showing off, right?
Yes,
But
exactly.
when individual lives embody a much broader principle, that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to return as we're kind of approaching the hour here. I want to return to some more broad questions. So we mentioned this at the start of our discussion that you cover a wide range of time, right, from the 1870s to more contemporary. And I'm curious, right, from your perspective, after having looked at such a historical period, right? What do you see as the broad shifts in the way that women approach their battles, or how they understand their legal battles as since the 1870s, right? Has there been any notable change in consciousness that you can kind of track throughout your
Yeah,
book?
well, we all know, of course, there's been a big change in women's consciousness, and women's understanding and assumption that, of course, I mean, you mean a man had to sign my credit card application? That's ridiculous, that kind of stuff. And young women who I speak to are a bit gobsmacked at all the stuff that was there. People still don't understand how the law works that well, and why should they? But it would perhaps be helpful if they did. I
Mhm.
mean, what we're also seeing, excuse me, what we're also seeing is a move away from the adversarial system from the courts. Something like 97 or 98% of cases never go to court, they're settled. And, that is a good and a bad thing. That settlement is easier on people. You don't have to go put yourself through the ringer as these women did. But what comes with settlement, and this is what I was thinking of when I said it's much easier to write about what came before. Settlement almost always means a non-disclosure agreement. So if it's a dismissal from employment, you talk it through, you settle, you say, fine, we'll give you X amount of money, and you will not talk about this. You will not talk about the agreement we reached, and you sign off. Well, and this began out of Silicon Valley when to protect trade secrets. You don't tell anybody how we made what we made. But where it's problematic is if there's any hint of misconduct, sexual misconduct, hint of racial discrimination. As soon as it becomes a crime, you can't bargain that away. That's not on. But it's that area beforehand. So, I mean, in the case we all know more about is the Hockey Canada case, where a young woman alleged that she was sexually assaulted by a Hockey Canada team and was paid off. So that's public money going to settle a legal case. Um, and so, what do you do with non-disclosure agreements? Because lawyers will tell you without them, you wouldn't reach settlements and the courts would be bogged down. And the courts, there are, I would guess, in all provinces across the country, tons of judicial vacancies. There aren't as many judges as perhaps there ought to be. So you got to do everything you can to move stuff along. So this kind of settlement and pulling things together that way, resolving things, is the way it goes now. People's awareness, though, I mean, I don't think most people fully understand like the difference between criminal and civil law.
Sure.
Civil in the in the common law sense, not in the Quebec sense. I mean, there's all sorts of terms of art here that
Sure.
Yeah, are difficult.
Yeah.
So
And it gets at the heart of a perhaps related but separate issue, the idea that, what do we know about the institutions that we're technically supposed to have recourse to, right? Like the law is meant to serve technically the people that it's protecting and so on. And yet if people are
yes,
not aware of it, right, it creates an extra barrier that stops, as we've been discussing many times, right, these changes that are so needed in society or so demanded in society. And so you do see this contradiction between what the law represents and what the law actually does in this case. And I just think that's an interesting thing that your answer highlights here that I wanted to emphasize.
yeah, thank you. I mean, the Canadian Bar Association did, with a strong majority, pass a resolution a few years ago saying that non-disclosure agreements should not be permitted in cases of misconduct. They continue, and they have a purpose. It's difficult stuff, but the law proceeds incrementally, right? And back to the women's stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, Bertha Wilson, the first woman appointed to the Supreme Court, was asked whether women judges will make a difference.
That was my
And
next question.
well, and she said, the goal was to show, as it were, both sides of humanity. And this is a more difficult concept. It's an organization named LEAF, Legal Education and Action, which was dedicated at the beginning to women's cases, where women lawyers acted pro bono in the case of points of law that had not been effectively resolved. That they said in one of their factums, their written arguments to the Supreme Court, that with more women lawyers and judges, would we find different vocabulary, different concepts to understand things that had caused us so much difficulty, trouble? So it's tough. And now it's made more complex with a more complex concept of gender. So non-binary, things like that. So, I mean, the problems, as it were, will never end. It's never going to be all neat and tidy. But you got to keep thinking it through and putting it forward.
Yeah, because that's the whole point of society.
Yeah.
To put it bluntly. Yeah.
Yeah. And you also can't take your eye off the rights are not guaranteed. I mean, we think of them as inevitably progressing forward. It doesn't work that way. I mean, Roe v. Wade is the most obvious example, the repeal of women's abortion rights in the United States. Yeah.
Yeah. to bring it back, the whole point of the book is in Canada. We see similar things in Canada as well, right? Rights being appealed or repealed and so on. So no, it's not taken for granted. Absolutely.
Yeah. And one thing, when I wrote the book, which wasn't that long ago,
Yeah.
the Quebec law that prohibited, legislative law that permits the wearing of religious symbols, be they crosses, be they Sikh turbans, be there hijabs, for Orthodox Jewish women, be they wigs. That law was being challenged. It has reached the Court of Appeal in Quebec, and the Supreme Court had yet to decide whether it would grant leave to appeal, and it now has. And one of the things that women's groups will be arguing, and this is complicated legal stuff. So there's a provision in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms that says, notwithstanding all the stuff in here, the rights, equality between men and women must never be violated. Now, that clause has never been adjudicated by the Supreme Court of Canada. Well, that's going to go before the Supreme Court. And we'll see what happens, because the argument out of Quebec by the Civil Liberties Association and some of the women is that this law does unfairly discriminate against women. So my bet would be the Supreme Court of Canada says it's okay. Yeah. So, I mean,
we'll see.
We will see. It'll take a while. It's wonderfully complicated stuff. And at the heart of it, there always has to be a person who comes forward with this, who says, I'll put myself on the line for you to judge what should happen.
Yeah.
And 3 cheers for them.
Yeah, 100%. Amen.
Yeah.
So obviously, we've talked about many cases and brought up many women that have tried to or succeeded in changing Canadian society in some way, shape, or form. And I'm curious, it's a simple question, but I'm curious, right, if there's any person that you wanted to include in the book but ended up not making the cut, like what kind of went into the actual construction of this book? Who do you wish you could have put in?
It's a good question. There's the last book I did was too long. So part of me was wanting to keep this a manageable size. And I just instinctively, journalistic instinct, if you like, looked for stories that were good and engaging, and embodied something that might have been part of your own life. There's quite a well-known case out of Toronto. It was a tax case that was brought by a woman lawyer. And the question was, could she deduct, and I'm grossly simplifying, daycare expenses from her income? And my understanding is, not having really followed it through, no. And I was told the other day that she, a lawyer who understood how stuff worked, really said at the end of this, I had no idea how hard it was to be a plaintiff, to be the one at the center of this. So, no, I didn't include that story, partly because it was a tax case.
Sure.
And maybe people generally would not feel as sympathetic to a tax case from a lawyer. Don't know. But no, not really, Okay. No, wanted to keep the book a manageable size, and the cases that are in there are pretty dramatic.
I agree.
Yeah.
The best possible way.
Thank you.
So one question that I always ask all the people that I interview is, what didn't I ask in this interview?
Oh, I don't know.
We talk about?
I don't know.
And what's the answer to that?
The answer to the question that you didn't ask. Well, you didn't ask me any questions about writing and the process, and I'm kind of glad you didn't. But I'll answer it anyway. No, it was a surprisingly easy book to write. There's a ton of stuff about all the legal argument. And I loved, I mean, I read more Supreme Court decisions to write this book than I ever did at law school. Um, but and yeah, it kind of flowed off the pen, as it were. Um, so that part was okay. I'm glad I wrote it. In the end, I sort of thought, oh, writing it, I didn't think it was that big a deal, but it's turned out quite well.
I'm glad to hear it.
Thank you.
So for people who are interested in picking it up, the book was released last week, right? At time of recording.
Technically, yeah, I think it was in stores a bit before, and on it goes. Yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. But I highly encourage people to check it out and to buy it wherever they can, preferably at your local bookstore.
Yes, yes. Indigo, I believe, is selling it, so is Amazon. But I mean, my local bookstore in Port Hope was magnificent. We had a launch on International Women's Day at the library, and over 100 people came. So it was
Wonderful.
really great.
That's awesome.
It was.
I always want to mention also, do you have any ways that people can contact you if they have any further questions or anything like that, or is it just through the publicist?
Through the publisher, I'd prefer. I'm not going to give out my personal email at the moment. Yeah, through the publisher, because undoubtedly there are people who don't agree with the way that some of the law was changed. Happy to discuss that, but via the publisher, please.
Yeah. Well, in that case, Karen, thank you very, very much for your time. This was absolutely lovely, and I, again, highly recommend it. It's wonderful and a necessary resource in this day.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I greatly enjoyed this. Thank you.
You know when you're really stressed or not feeling so great about your life or about yourself? Talking to someone who understands can really help. But who is that person? How do you find them? Where do you even start? Talkspace. Talkspace makes it easy to get the support you need. With Talkspace, you can go online, answer a few questions about your preferences, and be matched with a therapist. And because you'll meet your therapist online, you don't have to take time off work or arrange childcare. You'll meet on your schedule, wherever you feel most at ease. If you're depressed, stressed, struggling with a relationship, or if you want some counseling for you and your partner, or just need a little extra one-on-one support, Talkspace is here for you. Plus, Talkspace works with most major insurers, and most insured members have a $0 copay. No insurance? No problem. Now get $80 off of your first month with promo code SPACE80 when you go to Talkspace.com. Match with a licensed therapist today at Talkspace.com. Save $80 with code SPACE80 at Talkspace.com.